Oh, okay. Whew, what's going on here? What's going on?
Yeah, so the person was on like what drew you to this place? Perfect. Which is I guess number 2. What is your yeah. But it's like bus center, coming up to the partner ceremony. And then
I'll be your slide clicker right here. Or I can hand it to you if you'd rather, but I can just... Oh, you got a clicker. Okay, you're good. Okay, great.
I got it.
That's
wait,
hers,
Scott,
but I will move it.
Can you go to my slides first? Look at you, fancy.
I mean...
Start when you go to microphone, and then turn one, and then you'll do what you do this path first, or we can go back and forth.
All right, we're going on. Good morning, all.
So it's on right now.
Welcome. Can we hear? Can y'all hear okay back there? Really glad to be with you this morning. We've got a few remarkable women who we're going to have a conversation with about what they're up to in the world. You know, as I was thinking about this forum, I've said over and over, 7 years ago when I started, Ardell and I were just getting curious about Calvary. I've said over and over, it had a lot to do with the way Calvary pays attention to its context, its block. It's not, lots of downtown churches have particular ministries, but I hadn't experienced very many who were actually asking about blight and the structure of things. And so that's a story we're going to explore further with Margaret and Annie. But what was kind of cool then is as our work progressed, and as you all know, the work that's happened around the slave market site, going back to 2018's liturgy, and then even before that, we have 2 women in our congregation who left this place and went deep into the matters around what we do with sites like the one we have. So Annie Parker and Margaret Haltom both grew up here. They're at Calvary. They're going to talk a little bit about that. The other thing I was going to say was, I'm also, when I first got here, I would run into people in Memphis, and they would tell me that they were members of Calvary, but I'd never met them before. And I used to get kind of my note. I'd be like, "Oh, come on," because it's the people who come to Sunday school at 9:15 that no. But then I at some point I reframed it and realized that the reach of a parish is far beyond its walls and even the Sunday after Sunday folks who participate. I mean, you're the core, but lives are being touched and changed and challenged in ways that we don't even understand. So to have two people come back to Calvary who grew up here and went out into the world is also a unique reminder to me that the reach of what happens here keeps on going and going and going, and we have no idea whose lives we've touched and whose lives Margaret and Annie have touched along the way. So welcome to you both. It just worked out that they were in town for the holidays and were let themselves be talked into doing a forum. So I'm really stoked. So rather than me introduce you, I want each of you to talk about where you are now, what you're doing in your studies and your work, and what drew you to that. You guys flipped coins, I think.
Wonderful. And I love that you started with that, Scott, because Annie and I often call ourselves lifelong Calvary members, even though we don't live here in Memphis. So we always identify as being at Calvary since we were born, and feel like we have a really deep relationship with this place. And my name's Margaret Haltom. I'm about halfway through a PhD at MIT right now in their Department of Urban Studies and Planning. But my research is based in Memphis. I work with community development corporations here, and my closest collaborator is the Works Community Development Corporation. I know Rashawn, since you all are the avid adult formation attendees, you may have seen Rashawn speak to you all. She's a close mentor and a research advisor for me. And sorry to give you a shout out, Mr. Boyd, but Mr. Boyd has also been very influential to me in learning about community development corporations around Memphis and becoming really engaged here. And I will just share that a little about like why this school and why this path, and one thing I love is that I get to be between both worlds. So I have one foot in Boston where I teach and I do my coursework, and then I have one foot in Memphis. So I was here in the summer for winter break a couple times a semester where I do my research, and I got to teach a class this fall that was on housing data activism, and I brought students to Memphis from Boston. We got to go to the Civil Rights Museum, we went to the courthouse, and I love getting to kind of be between my hometown and MIT. And the last thing I'll say is people often think of MIT as a computer science kid, like engineering school, and that is not actually as squarely aligned with my interests. They actually have a very community-based research side of their work and a whole urban studies department. My advisor will come to class after speaking to Boston City Council. He's like very involved as an expert witness in affordable housing cases. So it's actually a really special place to learn how to do community-based research. And now everybody in my department talks a lot about Memphis. So yeah.
Can you say what your department, like what will your degree, your PhD,
Yes.
what's your subject?
It's urban planning. You actually get to name your own PhD at MIT, which is very weird. So I could finish calling myself a computer scientist when I'm not. I mean, just kind of kidding. But it'll be like urban planning and public policy. So I study more of affordable housing policy and community development.
Okay, I'll get started too. So I'm Annie Parker. I also, lifelong Calvary member. And I go to the University of Pennsylvania for a master's in landscape architecture and urban planning. So like Margaret Grace, I'm very interested in housing and interested in sort of the urban world as it's, as it manifests itself across the country. And I'm also in landscape architecture, which when I say landscape architecture, a lot of people are like, oh, can you do my backyard? And I'm like, I'll try, but it's a lot more larger scale and sort of community based in terms of when you look at what's it called, Tom Lee Park, that just got redesigned. That's graduates of my program I talked to in one of my classes last semester to learn how they did it and everything, but they are kind of who I'm going to try to be. I don't know if I'll get quite to their level, but landscape architecture is a little bit more flexible, but it's definitely a lot more design-centric and more into the details and the weeds of, actually how to make those parks and places. But as far as, how I got to Penn specifically is I was really looking for a place that I could look at historic memorials and injustice and combine that with community-based design in an environmentally sustainable way. So those three things are really what Penn offers and why I was looking at Penn specifically, and so that's kind of been my focus in my studios and everything, which I'll get back to in a second, but I guess I'll go through a little bit more of what led me to landscape architecture and urban planning specifically. So when I was in high school, I learned about this man, Brian Stevenson, and his book, Just Mercy, and it changed my life. He is amazing, and if you haven't read this book, very highly recommend it. Not only for his, legal work, which is something I was also really interested in doing at one time, but also in his philosophical work about humans being broken at their core. I think that's something that Calvary also really embodies and taught me a lot of as a kid. Just we're all imperfect and we're all trying our hardest, and I think that when it comes to working with our built environment, it's also kind of the same. When you think of the built environment, it's not perfect and it is broken because we are broken. And working towards a better future, I think, is something Calvary really taught me. I'm sorry, I'm going all over the questions here, but
testify.
Oh. But I think, so with Brian Stevenson, one thing that he did that was also very related to what I'm trying to do is that even though he's a legal scholar, I think he's brilliant in a lot of ways. And he actually designed the physical manifestation of this memorial. So one thing about this memorial that you may not know is that there are duplicate steel columns. So these are all representing all the counties in the South where lynchings occurred. And so you have the victims' names on these steel beams, and they're all suspended in Montgomery, and this is the site in Montgomery itself. But you have the duplicates of these steel columns in this kind of garden path area, and these are actually to be claimed by these counties once they've undergone a racial healing process within the counties themselves. So actually discussing their history, having community meetings about it, and really trying to bring about social change. And that was Brian Stevenson's idea, and so that blew my mind as an 18-year-old, and I was like, oh my gosh, spaces can do that. That's why I want to study memorials and monuments, and kind of why I'm at Penn. And yeah, I guess that's
I don't know
that's
if
enough for now.
if any of y'all read, Dan Conaway had an editorial in a column in the Daily Memphian maybe a year or two ago, saying he thought Calvary would be an interesting site for that. This is what he was talking about if you saw that. Dan just said that the work around the slave market, this would have been, I don't know that it'll happen, but it's just an interesting that Annie made that connection, and conversations, Lynching Sites Project are probably the people to make that happen in Memphis. But anyway, connection with what he said. Go ahead. How'd you get where you are?
Well, I think when I think back to high school, people talk about how your strongest memories are attached to things you smell. I don't know if you ever heard that. And for me, my first ever job was tending to the 40-foot long bison manure pile of Shelby Farms Park. So that will stay with you for a while. And I worked in their community garden. I taught classes to after-school programs. And I was a terrible gardener. Everything I grew died. But I discovered this real love of being in these communal spaces and getting to work with fellow youth at that age to imagine community spaces. I worked with some students. I was at White Station High School, and we designed a community garden right by the cafeteria that today is blooming and way more beautiful than when we were tending it. But I discovered this real love of community spaces, community development, and when I went on to college, I went to UVA, and one of my favorite professors was an urban planning professor, but she was also working at a low-income housing development, and I got to become her research assistant, and she taught classes between the university and at this housing development. And it was home to over 300 kids, so a really large-scale Section 8 development with a lot of youth, and they were undergoing their first ever redevelopment process, and they really wanted the process to be youth-driven and have kids actually at the table. And so that was a very formative experience for me, because I got to work with high school students and middle school students who were paid for their time for their first ever jobs to redesign the play spaces of their housing and to envision how they wanted their apartments to be redesigned, which was the first update to that redevelopment in over 40 years. So massive renovations happening. And that really spurred me to go on and get my master's in urban planning. And after my master's in urban planning, I moved back to Memphis, and I thought it was really meaningful to me to start my planning career in the city that I was from, that raised me, that pointed me towards this path. And so I worked with Neighborhood Preservation, Inc. at that time, then the Works Community Development Corporation. They merged together and had the opportunity to work on implementing the local emergency rent assistance program. And so my day-to-day work was helping tenants who applied for the program get eligible for assistance and get paired to legal services if they needed legal services. And so all of that pointed me to eventually going back to getting a PhD, where I still work alongside the Works, and I realized I could keep working with the Works and evaluate their programs and look at some of the big picture goals of a range of affordable housing programs while getting a PhD at the same time.
Big plug for the works. Y'all look them up. If you missed Roshan when she was here, she was fabulous. I'm sorry we don't have it all. This will be captured forever on the interweb, but hers is not. We weren't there. Well, tell us something about. Oh wait, before we go on to the next thing, something that really interests me that's not on this. Where I'm going off script. Sorry. Our kids, who are way hipper than us and obviously younger than us, talk about this new word, intersectionality. And it's really interesting as I hear you two describe the intersections of different, maybe in my time, there's an English major and there's a history major and there's a biology major. And then if you get, there's starting to be computer science majors, but not many. It sounds like your programs really draw from several different disciplines. Do you want to just say something quickly about that? Is that interesting, new, weird, hard, fun?
I think that's a special thing about urban planning, and Annie is doing both urban planning and landscape architecture. And urban planning sometimes is nestled in a design school, like what Annie is doing, and sometimes is in like a more public policy school. So it really bridges the worlds of community development policy and design work. And I think, and would love to hear Annie's thoughts on this, that like design thinking at this stage of life it was really formative to me to do my master's in urban planning in a design school, because you are hands-on, having to create something and propose something rather than only critique or only say what is wrong about the world now. So like in studio culture, you have to stand up and say, even if you disagree with how something goes, you have to say, here's what I would propose instead. And that was a very different thing than what I did in a more liberal arts major in undergrad.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about what intersectionality is especially in the creative disciplines, is a lot of times just merging. And I think that's like what design is generally speaking. It's merging like all of these skills from different parts of your education into problem solving in a much more applied way than like math per se. That's very rote, but it's a lot of times you're really searching for different parts of your brain while you're problem solving and thinking about things in a new way. And so I think that's definitely what drew me to design. But I think MG's definitely right when she says with urban planning in a design school, it's taught very differently and a lot more, between disciplines. And I think in terms of intersectionality, I'm both urban planning and landscape architecture. So for a lot of my classes, I'm using a lot more of my urban planning skills because I worked for 2 years after college in urban planning, both at the regional level in Chicago and then at the state level in California. I worked in their housing department. And so using those skills in my landscape classes a lot of times is kind of how I frame the problems. And I think, intersectionality it's the name of the game these days in the academic world.
I feel in the know. I'm an Episcopalian, so I like to throw esoteric terms out there that nobody else knows. So take us through some things you're working on now. Tell us what you're up to specifically, concretely. You're talking about projects.
Concretely, yes. Okay, so so for a lot of these slides, I just put them together kind of as, little helps for me, because sometimes I'll be at a loss of words. So I'll go through some that I'm not going to talk about, which is this stuff that I did in college, which we may get back to eventually, and that was after college. But this is kind of some of the work that I do in landscape architecture studios. So for my first landscape architecture studio, I was designing a garden in kind of a Shelby Farms type situation, which is kind of a weird place to design a garden. So I designed kind of more of a play garden that mimicked reef structures in the ocean. And so these are some of my drawings from that, trying to both create habitat for humans and for animals in a way that doesn't harm either. So that's just one of my projects. And then this is actually, so this is my second semester, and this is a project I like the most that I've done. And so it's all about indigenous land and the Lenni Lenape within the city of Philadelphia. So our site was a riverfront site, a lot like Tomley Park. But it was also the site, it's called Penn Treaty Park. It was the site of the Treaty of Shackamaxon, which was William Penn and the Lenni Lenape who lived there at the time, made a land agreement at that time. And so the land agreement was, as you could probably imagine, a lot more preferential to the settlers, and was later exploited by William Penn's children as kind of a way to steal a lot more land from the Lenni Lenape who lived on this land at that time. And so our site was where that agreement took place. And so I was really influenced by that and thought, this is a great space for a monument to the Lenni Lenape's removal. And so that's a map kind of showing the forced European colonization. So the X's are the colonized territory, and the kind of orangey area is the Lenni Lenape homelands. And so when you look at this map, the small gray dots are the these little dots right here and here, and then those up there are the remaining land that the Lenni Lenape, now the Delaware tribe of Indians in Oklahoma, and a few other tribes, as you can see with all the different dots, occupy. Sorry, that's way too in the weeds, but essentially it's just showing kind of the mass occupation of the United States in this map. And then this is the existing site conditions. This is kind of what Tomley Park in Philadelphia looks like, which is a very post-industrial site that has a lot of contaminants. So these contaminants I mapped in this way that there were different industries, as you can see with these weird shapes, that contaminated the soil in different ways. And so I was using phytoremediation, which is a way to soak up the soils with plants. That's a very non-scientific way of describing it, but we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty right now. But using plants to also restore the land as the land is given back to the Lenni Lenape. And so this is kind of what the design would look like in its first iteration is this memorial loop, and then you have the old Pico building there, but essentially the loop that you see in the center, this little walkway that goes under the building all the way over there, is kind of what I was proposing, and what studios kind of offer for people who are looking at landscape architecture is, how do you redesign this site? And so this was my proposal. And then this is it in 100 years down the line, because with phytoremediation, the reason that people don't do it often is that it takes hundreds of years to actually heal the land with plants. And that's not, economically feasible. And so and what's really cool and unique about studios is that you actually get to propose these kinds of things that really are not practical and would not happen in the world. But, this is just kind of an ideal situation that, what if this happened kind of thing.
So will your final grade be in 21, 24 or something?
Yeah,
Oh.
Yeah. That's cool. Grades are crazy in design schools. They don't matter. But this is kind of what it would look like on the trail as you would go under the building eventually. And then this is kind of the more kind of the area where it would be kind of repaired. And then this is what I worked on this semester. I'm going to go through it so fast because this semester was tough. So this is the quarries in the Lehigh County outside of Philadelphia. It was both a regional plan, so looking at all of Shelby County, and then it was also pick a site within Shelby County that you would, employ some regional strategy upon. It was a hard semester, to say the least, and so it was pretty much you could choose any issue. So I looked at clean energy, and I also looked at post-extraction sites, so old quarries. And this is a redesign of what one of those quarries would look like. So these are kind of the conditions of these different quarries, and then this is the site that I chose, which I can't even describe how this place looked. It was huge meteors just crashed one after the other right next to each other, and slopes of crazy steep slopes, and there's a view of them here on the right. Ignore, this is just kind of like a historic representation of what happened on the site on the left side, but on the right side, you can kind of see a view. This is what it looked like on the site, just like these beautiful lakes. And so this is what the site looked like. And then, yeah, we can just keep going. So the goals and strategy were support the transition to clean energy, look at the hybrid ecosystem of this space. So the quarries itself offered like, you know what, I'm not even gonna get into it. It's very cool ecologically, this project, and it's, it was kind of an idea of how do I apply this? But this is a very landscape architecture studio.
Well, but the word reparations flew by, and that kind of went radioactive in the culture because people, for lots of reasons, it just means repair.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's interesting that your projects, it seems clearly the different ones are just talking about how could we repair this place? Yeah. Some damage has been done to it. So fascinating, ecologically or socially?
I'm learning that my job is I'm cleaning up. That's my job.
There you go.
As a landscape architect.
What about you, Margaret Grace? What are you up to?
I love seeing these kinds of design projects because the urban planner is sometimes like a project manager or like a big thinker, and then needs the designer to actually show what a project would look like in reality. So it's really cool in my urban planning hat to see this kind of incredible design work. And it's always an urban planner's dream to get to work with a designer who like knows, the landscape and knows the site. And most of my work as an urban planner most of my research is based in the Klondike neighborhood of Memphis, which was the first neighborhood designed for Black homeowners within the city limits of Memphis. So a lot of people know the history of like Orange Mound, but Orange Mound was a settlement outside of Memphis that was pretty far removed from Memphis at the time, whereas Klondike was designed right next to downtown Memphis. And so if you all saw Rashawn speak, you may know about the cornerstone of a massive redevelopment project in Klondike, which is Northside High School. But it's looking similar to Crosstown, same architects, but it is like an affordable version of Crosstown. So Northside High School was the largest school in the Shelby County school system inventory, massive, multiple gyms, an auditorium that seats at least 1,800 people. We're talking very large scale school, and it is being redesigned into this beautiful range of community services, affordable housing. There's going to be a community mental health clinic, an after school program for youth to go and play sports that also shares with the school next to Northside, as well as affordable housing. So that's the kind of centerpiece of the project, and then around the project is a community land trust, and that's what a lot of my work is on. So I work closely with the developers as well as with residents and resident researchers who live in the neighborhood to evaluate the effects of the community land trust. And what a community land trust is it's a long-term strategy, and it's kind of viewed as the gold star in urban planning of investing an amount of resources in a neighborhood, but trying to prevent displacement and prevent the market from running up around an unprecedented redevelopment like Northside. So the way it works is residents get access to affordable home ownership. They can actually get a home below the market rate of that home, so below the appraisal value, and they agree to resell it below the appraisal value in the future. So they can make some money off of it. You can still, get some profit, but it prevents the market from running up and having homes resell at the highest possible value in the neighborhood. So a lot of my work is trying to see how effectively is that going to work, but also learn, not just in an effective statistical analysis. I take a lot of statistics classes because I'm interested in that, in more of those tools of policy evaluation, but more broadly, like what are the stories of the people who live there? What are the needs that people have? What are both housing and health needs? And how do you capture the memories and the legacies of this place? And one thing I've learned talking to a lot of people from Memphis and growing up 5 minutes away from this neighborhood is it's not a place a lot of people have heard about in Memphis. And so a lot of my work is capturing like the oral histories and the memories of people who live there, including civil rights leaders, people who marched with Dr. King, Some of the Memphis 13, who were the students who first integrated Memphis City Schools, are from this neighborhood. And the center of this kind of research is going to be housed at a future cultural center in the middle of the neighborhood. We talked a lot about Tom Lee, and it's actually going to be his historic home. So he was given a house in this neighborhood by the Army Corps of Engineers after he saved over 30 people in the riverboat crash. So this was his historic home, and it's getting restored into a center that honors not just his legacy, but what that legacy meant in the context of Memphis and the broader story of this neighborhood that a lot of people haven't heard of. So even today, I'm meeting with some of his direct descendants this afternoon, and I get to work really closely with residents in the neighborhood as well as people in the Lee family to think about what is their vision for restoring this center, and how is that also part of thinking of the future of this neighborhood? Like, how do you capture in future redevelopments the legacies of this place instead of kind of overwriting that history in future plans?
Fascinating. I love that, quickly laying an old quarry on colonized land, making it a flourishing place, to kind of structural wealth, this deep question of, like, there are different aspects of the same kind of repair that we're talking about that needs to happen in our world. Okay, I'd like to talk a lot more about this, but I just want y'all say just a little bit about, is there anything that happened to you at Calvary? Anything in your experience? Wait a minute, I could just stop there, couldn't I? Did anything? No. Anything in your experience of Calvary that led to this? I don't want to dwell on that for a long time because I really want you all to move into what we're doing now. But if you want to, give us a shout out, that's fine. You could do that.
Sure. Yeah, I talked a little bit about this in the initial answer of, like, why I'm doing this, and I think making God's love visible in downtown Memphis is really, what it comes to, and thinking about, the way that Scott started with how physically the church fits into the city and how that influenced me as a kid. I think that was a big part of it, and then also just the congregation itself's devotion to Memphis as the place that they live, and then also as a place that they could make better. I think that's a big part of, why I am who I am.
We'll take it.
So well said. And I think for me, Calvary taught me so much about what community ministry might look like. And in so many ways, partners in my life are partners who come back to Calvary. For example, like working on the emergency rent program, a lot of my work was with MIFA, and my family got connected to MIFA through Calvary. Or working on my master's thesis with Lynching Sites Project of Memphis, a lot of that was through Calvary's work and through relationships built here, and meeting with Eileen Farmer and her husband, Tom Mumberg. I wouldn't have known about them or had those relationships but for Calvary. And even in the pandemic, working across the street at the courthouse, we made these maps for tenants telling them Calvary's parking lot is the closest place you can go. So many things in my life and so many of the community partners I have are, like, foundational because of this place. And I will say, I was just thinking back on, like, my, growing up here, and I remember in Sunday school, like, walking through the Nicene Creed. I don't know why this, memory, really sticks out to me. There was so much unconditional support at Calvary to figure out who you are, what you believe in, and how you want to practice that in the world. I remember going line by line and, fellow high schoolers, debating whether they agreed with certain lines of the Nicene Creed. And that was a beautiful experience, to be growing up here and being, unconditionally supported to figure out, what your faith is and how you want to practice that.
That's the only commercial of the session, but that was fabulous. Thank you for your both for that. Do you want me to pull up some slides? I'd love to roll into talking about what's going on now. See if I can do this. Okay.
Yeah, so speaking of the parking lot at Calvary, as I'm sure you guys are all familiar, Tim Huebner did the historical marker on the site of Nathan Bedford Forrest's former home and slave market. I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, so this is the alley behind the nave. This is where the site is, a little Google Earth image of,
Wait, did an earthquake happen that I don't know about?
I know, yeah. It's very. But then, yeah, another view of it, and then just that is kind of the footprint that we're looking at. 64 feet behind the altar itself is where the slave market itself was.
Yeah.
Sorry. Sure, yes. Right behind the altar. So the way that it works is truly right there is where Nathan Bedford Forrest's slave market was, where we get communion every day, is where slaves were sold.
Because Calvary grew, this was the original Calvary. Yeah. We extended this way off through a little alley and onto that lot. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of chilling.
So,
that's the real.
Yeah. So that is the site that we're working on and where Tim's research has shown the footprint to be. Yeah.
Do you want to go next? So, yeah, this is a little ad. And we'll talk some about the historical research and the archival work that Tim has uncovered. But some of this background was in 2016, Lynching Sites Project and Tim Huebner worked together spotting this misleading 1955 Tennessee Historical Commission site, which described in extremely vague, horrific terms how Nathan Bedford Forrest, had business enterprises here that made him wealthy, but not mentioning that he, sold human beings or anything about the slave trade. And in 2018 was when an additional marker was unveiled. So many of you may have been there when there was the commemorative service at Calvary, and Tim Huebner and his students worked together to uncover some of the names of people who were sold. And there's also a documentary and a YouTube video online if you want to see some of the details of that service. And this is some of our team, some who were here, Margaret, Tim, of faith leaders, including, maybe Annie, I'll pass it to you to share some about who's on the team.
Yeah, sure. So it's Margaret Grace, it's David Lusk, who everybody is familiar with, and then it's Meredith Wells' mom. Sorry.
Dorothy Wells.
Dorothy Wells. I don't know. I always think of Miss Wells, but yeah, Dorothy Wells' mom. Shout out to Meredith. She's in med school. She's doing great. And then you got Tim Huebner. And then you got Ernestine Jenkins, who did a lot of research for kind of their tag team as far as the research for the past goes. Then you got Scott, and then you have Rich Watkins, who worked with you on the Lynching Sites Project, and then you have Margaret. So yeah, that's it.
I'll say Rich leads a lot of the Lynching Sites Project's efforts and has been a tremendous partner for us in figuring out what would it look like to redevelop this site, and how could they be a partner in hosting some of the dialogues or thinking through what future services and commemoration looks like at this place. And a lot of Ernestine Jenkins' research is on African American history and culture in the art history department at the U of M, and she's really uncovered what it means for Memphis to have been this site of urban slavery, and some of the misconceptions that we have when we think of slavery only as something that existed on plantations and not something that was embedded into the fabric of urban spaces like Memphis. So she's really taught us a lot about that. So this is our team that we meet together and think about what this site could become and try to learn together. And we're just gonna share like the three main components of this work, being research, a physical memorial, and being future commemoration services like on-site dialogues. So I'll start with the research, and I'll pass it to Annie for the memorial. Oh, yeah. And we're sharing this at very high level, thinking together. One thing we want to clarify is like nothing has been designed yet. We're going to show some precedents of places that we think have done a really powerful job of creating beautiful memorials that tackle histories of racial terror or tackle hard things and do a really good job of incorporating community members' visions into those designs. So we're just going to share who we've been learning from, realizing that nothing has been established or set in stone here. So part of this work is making a public archive available to people who want to learn about what happened at this site. I know Tim, by this point, has just been given many shout outs in this presentation, but has a recent publication detailing the history of this site where you can read and see some of these historic ads, see the railroad, which was down Adams Avenue near Forest Yard, and so learn about the role of this place in the trade in human trafficking in this region, and how people could buy enslaved laborers and put them on the railroad. So what was this site as a regional market, and what did that mean? So in the future, thinking about this forest site, how could people potentially come here but access an online archive or even like a in-person archive where they can learn more than just see a physical space? But the physical space is also a big component of it.
Yeah, one thing I'll also say about Tim's article is that it talks a lot about the making myths and talking about sort of the lost cause mentality of the retelling of forest history in sort of the 1960s and the 1920s, which kind of rewrote history and talked about Nathan Bedford Forrest as this sort of genteel man who had all these wealthy enterprises and kind of erased the reality of slavery. And I think that's a really big part of this story on this site that we're trying to tell and that we're trying to reverse is that revisionist history of this site and this place. Oh my gosh, I keep forgetting that we have the slides. So this is kind of like what I did on the Philadelphia site in terms of really looking at what's there and what's the history of this place is. And so, also trying to demonstrate that the altar is where this slave trading site was, but also kind of demonstrating that revisionist history that we talked about earlier with the Tennessee Historical Commission writing about Forrest's business enterprises, and then the kind of retelling that we're trying to do now that Tim has already started with this marker, and what could that kind of design look like in the memorial itself. And so that's something that we're considering about the space itself. But actually, you should talk about, sorry, not to put you on the spot, but you should talk about what the physical changes are going to be on the outside of the church. And why this fits in, I guess.
Sure.
If you want to.
So from the beginning, if you were participating in our conversations about our buildings and block going back pre-pandemic, when we were trying, again, at a high level to determine how we could turn toward the city in lots of ways, the one area that we just blocked out to say Calvary needs to not have complete control over this is the site that Annie's talking about, that 50 feet right behind the church itself. And we bracketed that. And one small grace of having to pull our scope back on the outside, we've pulled back the outside, so because we know we can do that later if we need to. We got to get the inside right. Was that it really created some space for us to say, how does that exterior, whatever happens there, how does it participate in what the rest of the block is doing? If we'd poured a bunch of asphalt, we would have locked ourselves in. So we've kind of left that a little bit open by necessity, but I think that's really important because we really want this to commemorate or to honor what happened at that site, but we want it to be in conversation with other public sites. And we want the block to be a beautiful place where people meet strangers and have events and do the things that you do in a city to bring a city block alive. I don't know if that's the question you asked, but that's kind of the bigger vision for the outside and how this would be part of a super important part of it. Yeah.
I think that's. And then, do you want to talk about this part?
And then the third part that we're thinking through is just how does this become a space that, just as Scott said, is a center for potentially on historical walking tours or a place where people visit downtown and can know or come to this place. And that is going to be really challenging to try to figure out how do you create this citywide space that maybe is commemorated on historic days or becomes a place of certain dialogues or poetry reading or like a place where people can gather and find some healing. And so some of the designs that we're going to share with you are places that we've looked at that we think do a really good job of tackling and trying to heal at the same time. So I'll start with this one, and Annie, I'll pass you the next one. And this is the Ed Johnson Memorial at Chattanooga, right next to the bridge in downtown Chattanooga. Ed Johnson was lynched in Chattanooga, and this is a memorial commemorating who he was and turning the light on the story of his lynching. And one of the really impactful pieces of this design process is how they made all of these public components accessible and made it more than just a physical redesign. So they have a scholarship for students who are committed to truth and justice. They have a website with virtual walking tours you can do where you learn about the history of what happened. And you could also see archival documents explaining this history. And then the actual physical design, we think, is a good example because it's a pretty small scale design. And this is a small, relatively small courtyard-esque kind of space we're talking about. And this was the sculptor Jerome Meadows. And a lot of these projects, there's an artist, or like often a local artist or somebody from the region, and then there might be a landscape architecture firm or a local landscape architect or someone who partners with the artist to make that design happen. Like you all saw Annie's beautiful renderings. Those landscapes are often created alongside the artist who might be a sculptor. And this is what it looks like today. And we got the chance to meet with the people who stewarded this space, and they talked to us about some of the unexpected pieces of the design process, including how expensive lighting or drainage or things are, which is something you have to, anticipate when you think about how these places get designed and what their budgets might look like.
So let's give them a couple more real quick, and then I want to make sure they can ask you some questions.
Oh, sure. You know what? We can, okay, I'm going to go through it super fast and just talk about, so this is the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers at UVA. Actually,
I'm happy to talk about it. Okay. It's a really beautiful memorial that has the names carved into it. So essentially this, if anyone has been to UVA, this is very central to the campus, right next to the historic lawn that Thomas Jefferson designed. And so the lawn is like right off on the edge of this photo. And this was an incredible amount of historical research that went into this site to uncover the names of enslaved laborers who built the university and carve those names into the memorial. And one thing that is particularly striking is the design leaves these spaces, which are carved into the rock to